Welcome to part 4, continuing our discussion about the spleen. The spleen is part of this earth element, if we look back to the 5-element theory. What's interesting about the spleen is that all through the TCM concept, the pancreas was not mentioned. It was not considered an organ. It was considered something similar to a gland, or something a lot like an empty piece of tissue. However, we know in the West that the pancreas is a vitally important organ, and in fact that without a pancreas you really can't sustain life. Whereas we can live without a spleen, it is possible. What I wanted to say at this point is, during this junction of my TCM training, having previously received classical training, I began to realize that a lot of the TCM model was compartmentalizing the work. In other words, they were putting pieces of information into little boxes. And then much later on, during TCM, I realized they were trying to then reconnect these parts. Where the difficulty came with reconnection was the reconnection could be attained through many different ways. This is because the theory of Chinese medicine is so vast and so large that TCM couldn't keep up with the various different ways, if you like, to cook an omelette. So there are multiple different ways that we can cook an omelette. We can beat the eggs, we can just put the eggs in, scramble them, cook them together. We can grill an omelette. There was all these different methods to achieve the same result. And when you start over compartmentalizing, that's putting things into segments and compartments, it then became very hard to unravel. So what happened later on in the evolution of TCM was they started to look back at different methods of diagnosis. So you could diagnose according to, obviously, looking, smelling, listening, tasting, touching. You could diagnose according to the 5 elements. You could diagnose according to the 8 principles that we already discussed. In reality, from my experience as time went on with TCM and this issue with the spleen, pancreas, I realized that a lot of our hormone problems, a lot of our health problems are coming from overexcitation of the pancreas. And so this is kind of an oddity in Chinese medicine, that some organs were only considered later on, of which the pancreas is never really mentioned. When you first learn Chinese medicine, they very rarely talk about the brain or the uterus. They see these things as extraordinary organs, and they're classed as extraordinary organs because they were only suddenly discovered later on as being important. For many centuries, the brain was considered just a blob of marrow. So while we study the classics or we study the TCM models, we still must consider what we know in the West as well. So this was the oddity of TCM. If we were merging Western and Chinese culture together, well, why weren't they more considering the brain? Why weren't they more considering the pancreas? And it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that these things started to emerge, when we had acupuncture anesthesia, we had scalp acupuncture being developed. scalp acupuncture actually being one of the more modern acupuncture systems, believe it or not. So aside from digressing, I began to realise that TCM was kind of a watered down version of the classics, mixed with Western knowledge. When I investigated deeper and deeper on, a few of my colleagues who have lived in China and worked in China basically advised me that a lot of the modern TCM ways that we follow in the West were developed from set leaderships. In other words, certain doctors were chosen, they were advised to come into the Communist Party, and they were given positions of power, teaching, and directorship. So, what I have learnt from travelling there is some of the most talented doctors I've ever worked with called themselves TCM, or had trained in TCM in the 1950s, but were actually following some of the more ancient ways. And this is what made them stand out. And most of the time they were left to the devices, or their own devices, or they were kind of sectioned off in their own little department. Nothing was really said to them, which is quite interesting, because Chairman Mao once said that he wanted to remove the esotericism. He wanted to remove the old ways from Chinese medicine. And often his Communist Party had a very heavily influence on editing books that were being produced in the 70s and 80s about Chinese medicine. What we've gotten to now is a situation where we're going through a bit of a revolution, where we're seeing the works of Master Dong, Master Chao Chen, even the late, recently deceased Dr. Tan, and his modern interpretation of the classics. We're seeing a resurgence in a movement towards simpler ways, more classical ways, ways with more immediate results. I suppose the real purpose of these lectures is to give you an insight into my understanding of TCM from when I learnt it back nearly 20 years ago to how it evolved for me. When I was learning the classics, the stomach and the spleen were a central focus in my training. My teacher used to say to me, these were the foundations for all your diagnosis, for all qi development in clients that you are struggling to treat. And when you think about it, the stomach, receives food from the outside, rottens and ripens it, and allows food to be processed and transported via the spleen. It's the core principle to us staying alive, apart from obviously breathing, but without food, 30 days or more we die. Without water, 3 days or more we die. Without air, 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes we die. So there are hierarchies, but being a classical system that I trained in originally, and now looking at it from the TCM, a lot of the deficiencies in the human body that you see in these books are based around the digestive system, the production of blood, poor digestion. We have to remember that the study of the spleen and stomach was heavily influenced in the 1950s by the huge lack of food and starvation that was going on around that time. In the next part, we'll discuss further how TCM views the spleen from an energetic point of view. Thank you.